So as Canada continues to work toward a trade deal with the U.S., another country is feeling the impacts of the U.S. president's ongoing trade war.
Imagine a world where a 200-year friendship between neighbors collapses overnight, where trade routes built over decades suddenly break down, where the United States' largest ally turns its back on Washington and chooses a new partner on the other side of the globe. This is not the plot of a political thriller or an alternative history. It is the decision of Canada, which has announced a complete overhaul of its trade policy. Instead of its traditional ties with the US, it is now betting on India.
A number of sectors that are going to be particularly hard hit, with President Trump saying that this move was made because of India's continued imports of...
Questions immediately arose. Why India? How can it replace the United States, with which Canada was linked not only by economics but by an entire civilization? And most importantly, what does this mean for Americans themselves? After all, they have been dictating the rules of trade in North America for decades.
Acceptance that the 50% tariffs are here now, at least in the short term, and businesses are trying to brace up for the impact.
Economists warn that the blow to the US could be comparable to a trade blockade. Billions of dollars in exports, grain, oil, cars, electronics suddenly lose their main buyer. Canadian ports are now oriented towards the east. Ocean container ships fill the routes to Mumbai and Chennai, and the border between the two North American giants is gradually becoming a symbol of political mistrust.
Textiles, for example, they'll be hard hit, and business owners I've spoken to have been saying that they're worried that what will happen now is US buyers will turn to other countries that are now more competitive.
It would seem that two neighbors with the longest land border in the world cannot afford such a rift. But Canada has taken a step that would have seemed unthinkable 10 years ago. Ottawa insists that the decision is dictated by the desire to diversify the economy and integrate into the new Asian century. India is happy to accept the offer. Its growing economy is looking for new markets to export pharmaceuticals, technology, and cheap industrial goods.
I have with me Vishwanshu Agarwal. He's a textile manufacturer and exporter who has businesses across the value chain, from weaving to finished goods, apparels, etc.
But what lies behind the official statements? Are there hidden political reasons for this move? Let us recall that in recent years, relations between Washington and Ottawa have been increasingly accompanied by mutual recriminations. The US accused Canada of being overly oriented toward China and having too soft a climate policy. Canada, in turn, saw the US as an unreliable partner, prone to using economic pressure to achieve its goals. And now we see the result, a strategic shift towards India.
Russian oil, which Trump says is helping to fuel Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, the impact on the economy, analysts are saying that could be up to 1% in India.
For ordinary Canadians, this is not just a geopolitical game. It means changes in supermarket prices, the disappearance of familiar brands, and a restructuring of the automotive market. Some see this as a chance for the country to become an Asian player and free itself from dependence on one neighbor. Others talk about the betrayal of shared values and history, because it was the US and Canada that built the North American dream together. The US, meanwhile, finds itself facing a challenge for which it was not prepared. They are losing not just a market, but a close ally. And now the White House is wondering, should Canada be punished with sanctions, or should they try to bring it back to the negotiating table?
Financial assistance. There have been comments from trade experts as well, who are pointing out that this seems to be quite an unfair move, because other countries, including China, which the US doesn't have a great relationship with, they're facing lower tariffs, and India, which seems to have been a friend to the US over the years, is facing these exceptionally high tariffs. Let's have a listen to comments from the Global Trade Initiative on this.
In today's episode, we'll look at how Canada replaced trade with the US with trade with India, why this became possible, and what will happen next. We have a story about betrayal, new alliances, and how one country decided to challenge America itself. The news that Canada is completely severing trade ties with the United States and shifting all economic activity to India came as a bolt from the blue. Just yesterday, it seemed unthinkable that the US's largest trading partner, its closest neighbor and ally, would take such a radical step. But the Canadian Prime Minister's announcement was accompanied by dry figures and tough arguments. We must step out of the shadow of one neighbor and find our place in the world of the 21st century. Behind this decision lies not just economics, but a whole new philosophy of Canadian politics.
First, Archana, I would like to thank you and BBC for giving me this global platform to express on behalf of the industry how we are dealing with these uncertain times. Archana, coming to your question.
For decades, Canada and the US have been so intertwined by trade flows that many economists have called their economies Siamese twins. More than 70% of Canadian exports went to the US, and American goods filled the shelves of Canadian supermarkets, from cars to medicines. Nearly 20,000 trucks crossed the land border every day, and the volume of mutual trade exceeded $500 billion a year. But in recent years, cracks have increasingly appeared in this relationship. Tariff wars launched by Washington during the Donald Trump era, ongoing disagreements over energy, and criticism of Canadian environmental policy by American companies have gradually eroded trust. The culmination was an agreement signed in New Delhi and Ottawa earlier this year, under which Canada pledged to redirect almost all of its export flows to India. The agreement, called the Indo-Canadian Strategic Corridor, calls for the creation of a single trade zone, the reduction of tariffs to historic lows, and India's multi-billion-dollar investment in Canadian infrastructure. A fictional but telling fact, in the first weeks after the contract was signed, new terminals began to be built in the ports of Vancouver and Halifax, focused exclusively on ocean shipments to India, while terminals for trade with the US stood idle in anticipation of a reduction in cargo traffic.
They say that India can absorb this overall, but it's those certain sectors that might be impacted very badly, and particularly small and medium-sized businesses find this much harder with potential job losses. That sectors including gems and jewellery, auto components.
The reaction of global markets was violent. The Canadian dollar unexpectedly strengthened as investors believed in the prospects of the Asian market. Shares of Indian pharmaceutical giants and IT companies jumped by tens of percent, while in the US the Dow Jones Index lost more than 3% in a day, the biggest drop since spring 2020. Politicians in Washington were quick to criticize the move. A senator from Texas called Canada's decision economic treason, while the former head of the State Department said it was a stab in the back that America will never forget. However, for Canada, this move was not just a gesture of defiance. Ottawa openly says that India is the future of the global economy. With a population of over 1.5 billion, already surpassing China in terms of population, the country is becoming a new center of growth. Canada sees India not only as a market for its agricultural products, but also as a source of cheap technology, medicines, and industrial goods. A fictional but plausible analytical report by the Canadian Ministry of Trade notes, cooperation with India over the next 10 years will increase Canada's GDP by 12%, while dependence on the US has left the country in a state of chronic vulnerability.
Vishwanshu, the 50% tariffs are a reality today as we speak. What's really happening on the ground right now when we talk about factories like yours focused on the US market?
In practice, cooperation is already evident in specific areas. India has agreed to purchase grain from Canada, which previously went mainly to the US and China. Canadian farmers from the prairies are signing long-term contracts with Indian processing companies, and the first harvest of the current year is already planned to be shipped via new ocean routes. In return, Indian pharmaceutical corporations are flooding the Canadian market with cheap generics, which is causing delight among patients but concern among American drug manufacturers. There is a particular focus on technology. The Indian IT sector, known for its powerful outsourcing system and startups, sees Canada as a new platform for expansion. The construction of a technology park in Toronto, jointly financed by Indian and Canadian investors, has already been announced. A fictional detail, but one that fits organically into the picture. As part of the Digital Maple project, more than 100,000 Canadian specialists are to be retrained to work in Indian IT companies. But behind the impressive figures and promises lie serious challenges. Logistics remains the Achilles heel of this alliance. Whereas goods used to be able to cross the border with the US in a matter of hours, now it takes weeks to get them to India. Ocean freight is more expensive, riskier, and dependent on the global political situation. Any instability in the Indian Ocean or the Suez Canal could paralyze trade. Critics within Canada are already warning that dependence on long sea routes will make the country even more vulnerable.
in terms of their prices, simply because their import duties for the US are lower than India's. That 50% is among the highest in the world, with that 25% being added on and coming into effect today. So that's going to make it very, very difficult for businesses, particularly those that really, really do depend on the US almost exclusively in the cases of some, say, small companies, which will then have to cut jobs and will be struggling. And they're calling for the Indian government to step in and offer some kind of...
There are also cultural differences. Despite the strong Indian diaspora in Canada, the scale of cooperation involves not only business but also interaction at the level of quality standards, regulation, and legal norms. India is known for its complex bureaucracy, while Canadian companies are accustomed to the transparent American rules of the game. Already in the first stage, several deals for the supply of electronics fell through due to inconsistencies in technical standards. Nevertheless, both sides are determined to move forward. India sees Canada as a gateway to the Western world, while Canada hopes that cooperation with India will open up new Asian markets. Interestingly, there is even talk in the corridors of the Canadian Parliament of a gradual transition to settlements in Indian rupees, which would be a real challenge to the dollar's hegemony. This is still fiction, but experts consider it quite possible in the future. For the US, the situation looks threatening. Its main trading partner is leaving its orbit, while China and India are strengthening their positions in North America through Canada. This is changing the entire geopolitical architecture of the region. Whereas North America used to be a single economic bloc, now there is a rift running right along the 49th parallel. Canada is betting on the future, risking the present. The country's economy is going through a painful transition period, but the authorities assure that in 5 years, new alliances will bear fruit. India, meanwhile, has a unique opportunity to strengthen its influence by becoming not only a software factory and a supplier of medicines, but also a full-fledged player in the global resource market. The world is watching with bated breath to see how this unexpected alliance develops. And no one can say with certainty whether, in a few years, the US will find itself in a position where it has lost not only a neighbor, but also one of its last loyal allies.
Customers are now, with this 50% tariff, especially US customers or only US customers are not, willing to sort of, they can't absorb these kind of margins in our industry, and they are definitely looking for alternatives. So, orders haven't been coming in lately.
The economic blow that America received after Canada's decision to redirect trade towards India turned out to be much more painful than even the most pessimistic analysts had predicted. The US has come to regard Canada not just as a partner, but as an extension of its own economic system. For decades, thousands of American companies have built their business models with an eye on the Canadian market. Farmers in Iowa and Nebraska planned their corn and soybean harvests in advance based on the needs of Canadian processors. Detroit automakers included steady supplies of components from Montreal and Windsor in their estimates, and energy corporations counted on uninterrupted oil and gas exports across the northern border. Overnight, these ties became fiction. The first tangible consequences were felt in agriculture. American farmers, who had relied on Canada as a stable buyer, were faced with overproduction. Warehouses in the Midwest were overflowing with grain that could no longer be sold as usual. A fictional but logical fact. In several states, farmers' cooperatives appealed to Congress for subsidies to destroy surplus crops, as storage had become more expensive than the produce itself. These images, bulldozers dumping grain into huge pits, became a symbol of the crisis and made the front pages of newspapers. The automotive industry also found itself in a trap. For decades, the North American auto industry was a single organism, with individual parts manufactured in Canada, then shipped to factories in the US and back again. The disruption of supply chains caused chaos. Fictitious but plausible data leaked from Detroit shows that every day of factory downtime due to a lack of Canadian components cost companies tens of millions of dollars. Labor unions are demanding government intervention, and experts are talking about a second deindustrialization of the American Midwest. But it is not only the economy that has felt the consequences. The political repercussions have been enormous. A heated debate has erupted in Washington, how to respond to Canadian betrayal. Some politicians, especially those on the right, are calling for tough measures, from imposing tariffs on Canadian goods to freezing joint projects in the energy and defense sectors. Others, more moderate voices, speak of the need for negotiations and compromises. because the loss of Canada threatens America with the loss of strategic control over the entire northern region. Harsh statements are being made in Congress. A senator from Ohio said at a meeting, "We have lost not just a market, we have lost a brother with whom we shared bread and oil." Newspapers published cartoons showing a maple leaf turning away from the stars and stripes and reaching towards the silhouette of the Taj Mahal. Fictitious sociological surveys show that more than 60% of Americans perceive Canada's decision as a betrayal, and a quarter believe that the US should reconsider its participation in alliances with Ottawa, including even military agreements. At the same time, pressure from the business community is mounting. Major corporations that have lost the Canadian market are demanding compensation or at least tax breaks. Lobbyists from the auto and agriculture industries are staging endless hearings in Congress. The White House finds itself in a delicate position. On the one hand, the administration cannot afford to show weakness to voters, but on the other, excessive pressure on Canada could push it into the arms of India and China. The situation is complicated by the fact that the rift with Canada is changing the entire architecture of North America. The USMCA agreement, which replaced NAFTA, is now under threat. Mexico, which formerly remains in alliance with the US, has been given an unexpected opportunity. It seeks to fill the vacuum that has formed and offers Washington to expand trade flows. At the same time, however, Mexico is losing the Canadian market, where it traditionally supplied its products through the North American corridor. The result is a paradox: gains in relations with the US turn into losses in relations with Canada. Fictional but convincing details: Mexico City is beginning to discuss a new Southern Corridor project, which would connect Mexico with Brazil and Argentina, bypassing Canadian routes. According to Mexican analysts, this would compensate for the loss of its northern neighbor. But so far, the project exists only on paper, and the country's economy is teetering on the brink. The breakdown of North American integration opens up new opportunities for other players. China is closely monitoring the situation and has already offered Canada to expand its energy exports to the Asian market through its own logistics networks. The European Union is talking behind the scenes about the need to strengthen cooperation with Canada to prevent India from gaining complete control over the new alliance. Thus, North America is transforming from a closed and stable bloc into a field of competition between world powers. In America itself, alarming predictions about rising unemployment are beginning to be heard. Economists note that if the situation continues, by the end of the year the country could lose up to 1 million jobs related to trade with Canada. In the Midwest, spontaneous rallies of farmers and factory workers are emerging, accusing Washington of inaction. The slogan "Bring Canada Home" is appearing. Military experts are also concerned. If Canada increasingly moves toward India and potentially China, the question arises, will the NORAD alliance, which provides joint airspace defense, remain intact? Even a hint of a weakening of this cooperation is causing alarm in the Pentagon. A fictional but symbolic episode. During joint exercises in the Arctic, Canadian aircraft demonstratively failed to arrive for planned maneuvers, citing technical reasons. The US interpreted this as a political signal. Against this backdrop, questions are increasingly being raised about the future of American leadership in the region. America is used to being the center around which its neighbors revolve. Now, however, Canada is showing that Washington no longer has a monopoly on allies. This shift in perception could prove more dangerous than any tariffs or duties. A new North American architecture is taking shape before our eyes. Canada is building bridges with India and Asia. The US is forced to look for ways to maintain its influence through Mexico and Latin America, and the entire region is becoming an arena for global players. Economics, politics, security, everything is interconnected. While Washington argues about how to respond, Canadian ships are already leaving the Atlantic coast, with cargo bound for Indian ports. And each such voyage is a reminder that North America will never be the same again. Canadian society, accustomed to the relative stability and predictability of its economy, found itself deeply divided after the government officially announced a complete shift in trade from the United States to India. For millions of citizens, this decision was not just a change in trade routes, but a real turning point in their worldview. Canadians, who for decades had lived in close contact with American goods, culture, and the labor market, felt for the first time that their country could exist without its usual dependence on its neighbor. But the price of this existence is not yet clear to anyone. In large cities such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, a significant part of society welcomed the shift to the east with enthusiasm. Young people see new opportunities in India educational exchanges, internships in IT companies, cheap medicines, and access to a market of 1.5 billion people. In a fictional but realistic episode, the Toronto Student Association organized India Week, which featured Hindi lectures, Indian cooking workshops, and a startup fair with Indian investors. Attendance at the event was record-breaking, more than 20,000 people over 5 days.